For the second session of 2024's first Widening the Pipeline virtual training, we're going to focus on the realm of consumer investigative reporting. I'm sure many of us have seen through the years the special features that our local news television stations have produced. They've been heavily promoted and put out as a public service for people. Arguably, the most popular ones uncover illegal or harmful practices, or they help expose scams and recover funds for unwitting people. But how does consumer reporting broaden its impact when a journalist of color is actually sitting in those news meetings and making those pitches for editors? Well, journalist Caresse Jackman has joined us to answer that question. She is a national consumer investigative reporter based in Washington, D.C., with Gray Television's InvestigateTV. Previously, she was a consumer investigative reporter for WSMV-TV in Nashville. And she's also reported in New Orleans and Flint and Columbus, Mississippi. Her work has also contributed to her stations winning multiple Emmy Awards and Edward R. Murrow Awards. You can read her full bio on our website at nationalpress.org. Caresse, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. And I think it's such an important topic to discuss, especially as people of color. So I'm more than happy to do so.
So before I let you get into the presentation that I know that you've prepared for us, I should let you know that I shared your LinkedIn post about the NICAR conference with the journalists to help them prepare for not only your presentation, but for this overall discussion. So before you get into your presentation, please restate to us why you felt it was important to share that on LinkedIn.
Oh, absolutely. So you're talking about the one about the Native woman that came up to me at the table? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was important because oftentimes we don't know who's watching, we don't know who's reading, and we don't know the impact it would have on people when you're doing these reports. You hope that the message will be loud and clear, but it means more to me. It means more to me when I know that somebody, especially another person of color, sees a story or reads a story, and it truly helps them along the way. Because in many cases, we go through some of the same issues. As Black people in this country, a lot of our stuff has not been documented. A lot of the data that we need has not been recorded, and purposely done in many cases. And so when she came up to me, I was already also having a rough day that day. So when she came up to me, that truly made my day, because it just shows you never know the impact that your work will have on another person who's also trying to fight a similar battle or also trying to push for other stories of representation. So it meant so much to me to see her and for her to say that to me. And that's why I felt the need to also share her work.
Let me ask you to quickly restate the circumstances for people who are going to be watching it for the first time on video.
Oh, so basically about the interaction that we had.
Yes.
So I was at NICAR in Baltimore. It's a data journalism conference, and I was eating with my coworkers, and a woman approached me and said, "Are you Caresse Jackman?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I just wanted to let you know that I attended one of your sessions in Atlanta where you talked about your Sacred Ground series, which is what I'm going to show you all soon." And she said, it gave me motivation to do what I wanted to do, which is create a database for murdered Indigenous, transgender women and broadcast it to the world. And I was like, wow, that's moving, because for my story, I noticed that there weren't a lot of databases that were out there for people when it comes to documenting the desecration of Black remains. And so to hear her say that to me meant everything to me. And it was a special moment, because I was feeling like there are times where you even feel like even the years of experience I have, like, is it worth it sometimes, right? And that was just another reminder that, what we do and what we experience and the stories that we bring to the table are important. And so that was what meant a lot to me.
Caresse, your energy is so palpable and engaging. So it's just been a pleasure just getting to know you initially. I should tell the journalists that following people on LinkedIn and
Yeah.
sometimes even stalking them can pay off.
It
Because
does.
I didn't realize that one, Caresse was at the annual awards dinner at NPR or for NPF. So there was that. And then now I feel like she's going to make a connection with our Widening the Pipeline journalists. So let you take it away with your presentation.
Sure, absolutely. And I can share my screen, correct? Yeah,
Yes.
Here we go. Awesome. Well, again, thank you all so much. I'm honored to be here to talk to all of you. And basically what Rachel and I talked about just recently is what I'm going to talk about, widening the pipeline and doing stories about systemic issues that are impacting us in our communities. So it's a presentation. I'm going to show you two particular stories that deal with systemic issues, but also have pretty much a consumer related angle to that. So can you guys see all of that?
Yes.
All right, good. So we'll discuss pitching investigative stories with systemic issues, storytelling and the process, as well as showcasing some of the stories and the outcome. And excuse me, I think this is also still a consumer story because it deals with business practices, sometimes faulty business practices. And more than anything, if it's affecting people generally, oftentimes it's affecting people of color more. It's creating an even heavier impact on people of color. So the first story I'm going to show you all is the desecration of Black cemeteries, which is what I discussed. This was a year-long project, and it's still ongoing. But what I'm going to show you is pretty much a brief recap of what the story is about. And it was me and my colleague, Daniela Molina, who's an amazing investigative producer with us on InvestigateTV. We worked so hard on this story, and we'll talk about some of the headaches that we experienced along the way. So here we go. This is just a brief clip about the first two stories that I did.
Because it goes back to a basic fundamental question. That question is, are Black people human?
Everybody deserves a decent burial. You just don't throw a person away.
We have a lack of respect for those that have gone before us.
Federal agencies have not been blameless in their treatment of burial sites.
We need to come to the cemetery and keep our people grave clean, and we'll know what's going on with them.
And our national investigative team found it's not a singular case. We found dozens of other cases where African Americans are consistently fighting to protect the land of their loved ones from construction and development. The complicated web of tracking Black cemeteries is as complex as American history itself. Following the end of slavery, many African American families continue to face restrictions on where they can bury their ancestors. Across much of the U.S., local law segregated burial sites by race. African American burial grounds often fail to receive the same type of maintenance and record keeping that predominantly white burial grounds enjoyed. Fast forward over a century later, and the country's dark past makes discovering Black burial sites a challenge state and local governments face to this day. Every state in the country has cemetery laws, but they differ from place to place. In most states, violating cemetery laws and removing remains is a misdemeanor, but in some states, it's a felony. Permits are supposed to be filed if someone wants to legally remove remains if they're discovered, but InvestigateTV found that the permit process is hardly tracked for African American cemeteries. Willeen White Smith comes to this cemetery to reflect on her loved ones. But there's always a feeling of sorrow, not only for grief, but for what she calls an injustice. Willeen says the names of her loved ones are nowhere to be seen on this land south of Atlanta.
Can you tell me, did you place our relatives in a mass grave, or did you actually come out here and make provisions for all 344?
This is my great Aunt Betty, and she used to sit right here in this pew every Sunday.
It's the same reason Frank Washington refuses to give up his fight. He says he won't rest until his community recognizes his family, remembers their history, and respects his battle to preserve them.
That regardless of what they've done, it's not going to change my belief in myself. It's not going to change the fact that I value who I am. It's not going to change the fact that I value those bodies lying in that grave. Whether I know their last names or not, I know they existed. I'm proof that they existed.
This landscape, I talk about it as a landscape of freedom, because here is what you get to see that Black people saw for themselves as free people. This is what dignity looked like.
How important is the preservation of our Black cemeteries?
Oh, so important. This is where Black history exists.
I don't care who's doing the desecration. You can be government employee, you can be private sector, you can be nonprofit. If you're desecrating the grave, you need to be dealt with accordingly.
Mr. Stevens paid an enormous amount of money to make sure it was done exactly right with the archaeologists. And every grave that was found was properly moved to its new location. There's no doubt about that.
Did you all do everything in your power to make sure that these remains were preserved and protected?
To my knowledge, they did.
But one of the states leading the way in collecting information on Black cemeteries is Tennessee.
Cemetery funding is few and far between everywhere, and I think that everybody in every state can say that.
Every time I handle one of these cases, I think, please let this be the last one. I think surely this won't happen again. And then it happens again. The sad thing is, who will speak for the dead?
So that was just a recap of a combination of different stories that we did. The first part 1 and part 2 of what we call Sacred Ground. And so we're going to talk about where it all began, but I wanted you guys to kind of get a grasp of what the series is about. So here's the thing. When pitching a story that's impacting pretty much us, you've got to be strategic, right? You've got to come prepared. I got that story based off of a tip. An old high school coach I grew up in Atlanta. So old high school coach from Atlanta called me up and said, Caresse, you need to come down here. There's been a fight that's been going on for years, but nobody's truly digging deep and addressing it. And it's about some remains that were moved from one location to the next, but there was no respect at all into where they were placed next. And I said, oh man. And so it's so funny. At first I was like, I don't know if I want to do this story, because I also knew the uphill battle I would have to climb to pitch the story to managers, to convince them that this is still a story that needs to be addressed, and then to tell it on a national scope, a national investigative scope at that. But he was relentless. And so I said, okay, let me start looking into it. So before you even pitch it to your bosses, I always suggest have an idea of what type of story you want to tell from beginning to end. Know the types of records that you want to file. So for me, after getting this story, I said, okay, how broad is this problem? I know it's broad, right? I know that this is an issue that is taking place east of the Mississippi River. Anywhere that there were Black people that were enslaved or Black people made a home, there are chances that there are Black cemeteries that were not well protected or documented. And so now it's just a matter of collecting that information. And so I knew that I would like to file an open records request, right, with with agencies, state agencies, to ask them, what are their records of cemeteries, specifically Black cemeteries, right? So I already knew before I went to my boss what exactly I wanted to look for. And then again, do some digging on your project before you even begin it. So obviously I knew that my source was coming to me with this information. What documents do you have? What property deeds do you have, right? Collect your receipts so you know exactly what you're looking for. And that, you could build a good foundation for a pitch to send to your boss. And also conduct background calls or Zooms, with people, if you have an idea of what you want to talk about. And sometimes they're more likely to be even more open with you when you want to finally do an interview. So after I reached out to the person in Georgia, I started looking into other cases that were happening nationwide. And I found a couple of lawsuits that were being filed, one in Virginia and one also in Maryland. And so for those two people, they don't know me. They don't know what my intentions are. So I had multiple background calls just to kind of introduce myself to them. And then I had a Zoom so they can kind of see my face and build that trust. And then find ways to pivot when challenges come your way, because they will. My coworker and I ran into so many cases where states either did not respond to us, or they pretty much said, well, we don't have that documentation. I'm like, well, why don't you have that documentation, right? So know that these things are going to come along, especially when you're doing stories that impact us. But it doesn't mean it can't be done. And then I'm just going to be real for a second. Many of our managers are going to probably be white, probably be male, and they have no concept or grasp of the issues that we face. So you have to give them an understanding in your pitches of why these stories matter, why it's important, and how impactful this story can be. So after talking to so many people, I finally created a pitch sheet, right? Now, this is a very rough pitch sheet that I did, but I wanted to show you like where I was coming from. So you want to make it so good that it's hard for your bosses to say no, right? You want to show that you've done your research. You want to show what the investigative angle will be, whether that's digging into like financing or following the money for something, or giving a story broader scope, right? So you can see here, I said, how often does this happen? Who authorizes these removals? Who regulates them? Are families allowed to have a say in the removal of bodies or the removal of a cemetery? If construction is being built? Those are the investigative hooks that you need for these types of stories, right? So it shows that it's not just one person, it's a broader problem than just one family alone. So that's the key. When I was a reporter in New Orleans, an amazing anchor told me, he was like, you know what, Caresse, when you're doing a story, yes, it's a singular issue. Like if I'm on a breaking news story, but show the broader grasp of it. If you're showing crime happening in New Orleans, compare it regionally to what other people are facing. And that stuck with me even until to this day. So if I'm doing a story, what's the broader appeal? How does this impact not just that person, but multiple people? And then once your story is given the green light, what do? Well, again, for our stories, you have to come prepared, and you have to be prepared to catalog your own data. I told you many times, we got so many headaches when we heard from people saying that they did not have the data or the data doesn't exist. In many cases, you're going to run into those hurdles, and that should be part of your story. So start creating and tracking a database where you're gathering information. We did this in many ways. Me and my colleague, Daniela, we started collecting a database. One, we wanted to know what all cemetery laws were in every state. And we also wanted to know what the permit process is like to remove these cemeteries if they want to build over them. And we also wanted to know, we also wanted to create a survey, which is why what Rachel mentioned about the young woman who approached me this weekend in Baltimore is we wanted to create a survey to see, okay, is this happening in your community? Let us know. And we received an overwhelming response from people after our first story aired. I mean, people were commenting and talking to us from Hawaii to Vermont, Mississippi, Ohio. And that showed me that even my initial thought was slightly limited. I thought it was just going to be places where east of the Mississippi River, where we knew there was a large Black population. But we saw it in all sorts of places across the country where Black cemeteries were being either built over, they weren't funded, or they weren't documented. And then just find also creative ways to illustrate and visualize your story. So you saw we made sure that we showed the map of the United States. You know, we made sure that we visualized the pictures of the desecration that was happening. So we tried to find ways to really visualize it. And we did it not only in a broadcast format, but also on the web too. And going back to what I talked about, creating a database or a survey for people to find, that was part of our web article. So we try to find creative ways of telling the story in a way that was never done before. Because I've seen many stories about Black cemeteries, right, where people are cleaning them up, and that's good. And I'm glad that it's out there, but I wanted to truly find a significant way of telling it from an investigative way. And so that's what we did. Again, I talked about the idea coming from a tip and the cases that we found in Maryland. And again, the investigative hook here, what's being done to protect these cemeteries? How prevalent is this? Asking every state for their permit process to remove their remains. And another hook that we got that we didn't even know we were going to have was we discovered that a law was indeed passed to help fund and preserve African-American cemeteries. But right now there's no money in the bucket. So Congress passed this law to help protect these remains across the country, but there's nothing being done with it. And so there also goes your accountability angle, right? So we went to lawmakers, which is going to be a clip I'm going to show in a minute, to say, what is the holdup? Why is it that you guys passed this? Was it for pomp and circumstance? Or are you all really trying to do something about it? And so when you're looking into a story like this, here are some things to remember too. Interview people in descendant communities, right? Families, groups advocating for preservation, activists, people who are really trying to push this forward. And again, those people it may take longer for them to open up, but once they do, they'll never stop contacting you. And that's what you kind of want, right? You want them to trust you with their story, with addressing the issue. And those are going to be the communities that you reach out to, not just even for just Black cemeteries, but any kind of issue that is happening to people of color. Attorneys, look at attorneys that are familiar with these kind of laws. The one woman who said, "Who will speak for the dead?" She was an attorney out of Tennessee that has dealt with the abuse of remains all over the country. And she was honestly a good hook to my story that I knew that I needed, but that I didn't have. Also, again, look at lawmakers who are trying to create change, and so I'm going to show you that again in a minute. And then accountability. Don't forget to make sure that you are contacting these developers, contacting attorneys representing them to find out what gives. Like, what are you all doing? What response do you have to say about the matter? Most of the time, like I said, no, one person I received in the video you just saw wouldn't talk to me on video, but he talked to me over the phone. I asked if I could record it. He said, yes. Okay, then let's start our accountability interview. And then the second one that you're about to see were lawmakers who left the Supreme Court here in Maryland, didn't really respond to me, but show tenacity, show persistence, especially if you're into broadcasting, show persistence that you really are trying to get them to answer your questions. So this is a clip, our most recent, this is my most recent story that I did. I did it last month. If you remember, I interviewed 3 people for my first 2 stories, a family in Maryland, a family in Virginia, and a family in Georgia. This one goes and tries to get the answers from lawmakers. And it also it's a follow-up to my case in Maryland, where they're now taking their case to the Supreme Court. And it's important because not many cases like this have been heard in the courts, in the courtrooms, but this one has gone all the way to the Maryland Supreme Court, and it could set a precedent for these kinds of fights, depending on the outcome. We still don't know yet. We probably won't know for several months, but I'm going to show you basically what the most recent story that I did. Here we go. Uh-oh, can you guys hear it okay?
When it comes to funding, the preservation of neglected and abandoned African American cemeteries, Congress passed an empty promise.
Why has it not been funded at this moment in time?
Well, it hasn't been funded because Congress too often engages in petty fights. I mean, it's why people don't like Washington too often.
Sherrod Brown is a U.S. Senator from Ohio. When he was contacted about an African American cemetery in his state desperately in need of repair, he wanted to act.
I heard about Union Cemetery in Cincinnati. We toured the cemetery. We saw the decades of neglect.
Brown, along with other congressional leaders, passed bipartisan legislation to create the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. Signed into law in December 2022, it provides a program of the National Park Service to provide grants and technical assistance to local partners to research, identify, survey, and preserve these cemeteries. Representative Alma Adams from North Carolina also sponsored the bill in the U.S. House of Representatives.
It's about the sacredness of our families and respecting people and respecting the sites that we've left them in.
Funding is appropriated through the congressional budget process. The National Park Service proposed $3 million for the program, as well as an increase of $1 million to spread across other grant programs. But after all of that, right now, there is no money. Congress didn't approve the budgets, leaving many descendant communities in limbo.
For the families who sadly have been fighting these battles to make sure that their loved ones' remains were sacred and taken care of, they sometimes feel like Congress doesn't care. People in D.C. don't care. What would you tell them?
Well, some of us care. We fought to get this bill passed. Not enough of us care, which is why we push my colleagues in Congress in both parties to do this right.
We have to get enough people to put this as a priority item. I think it is a priority item, but I also have to get my colleagues to think that as well.
Our national investigative team spent months exposing this problem happening all across the country. African American burial grounds at risk of abandonment, erasure, or being potentially destroyed by construction and development. Our team found that Black cemeteries are rarely tracked state by state. In most states, the permit process to remove remains from one location to the next is virtually non-existent for African American cemeteries, especially when historically burial grounds where enslaved Africans buried their loved ones were rarely documented or put on historical maps.
Should state agencies do more to make sure that these sites are protected?
Absolutely. States have a responsibility. The federal government has a responsibility to help the states in terms of providing the support, which is what we would be doing through the legislation that we're proposing.
If Congress can't act, families of loved ones who have passed on are hoping the judicial system can spur action.
This was the first time that a case of this sort has been argued in front of the Supreme Court of any of the 50 states.
Desecration is a hate crime.
In Maryland, the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, or BACC, is currently in a legal battle with a private developer and Montgomery County to preserve the burial grounds where enslaved people are buried. We first met Robert Stubblefield last year.
They paved a parking lot over it. That's on one part of the cemetery. The other part of the cemetery, they're trying to build a storage unit. We have to stay strong because the time is coming where future generations are going to be standing on our shoulders.
And this year, we caught up with Stubblefield and dozens of other supporters at a rally in front of the Maryland Supreme Court, following BACC's oral arguments to stop the construction.
There are times I think that we would have, that we probably would have made it far, but I don't think we would have been as strong as we are right now. Because when we started about 8 years ago, there was roughly 4 or 5 of us. And now all of a sudden we have crowds, and to the point that we didn't just pack the courtroom, we actually were overflowing the courtroom. I don't think we could have even imagined that.
Steve Lieberman, who represents BACC, hopes the case sets a tone across the country to pay attention to issues impacting Black communities and honoring the dead.
You wouldn't want somebody parking on top of your grandmother. I don't want anybody parking on top of my grandmother. The plaintiffs in this lawsuit should not be forced to watch cars park on top of their grandmothers.
Lieberman says the outcome of this case could set a precedent nationwide.
And I think people all across the country are going to be looking to this court to see if it's going to say that our legal system can do justice here.
I would Great Television just want to know if you'd like to respond. Attorneys for the developer did not answer our questions after delivering oral arguments, but told us previously that they properly observe the laws which protect burial grounds in Maryland, and that they acknowledge the significance of the African American history affiliated with this site, and will continue to respect and honor the legacy in the community.
If they don't make clear what the law is, this open season on descendant communities everywhere. That means developers, whether they're government agencies or private developers, they can run roughshod, they can develop on any cemetery they want.
Senator Brown and Representative Adams say they'll keep pushing for federal funding and support so descendant communities can visit their loved ones' burial sites and not worry if their history will be destroyed.
There's a proverb that when you drink the water, think about who dug the well. And that's what we need to think about in these. It's the people that are buried in that cemetery that build up our communities, our Black communities, our white communities, our communities overall, and we honor them.
So that was the most recent story that I did about Black cemeteries. But again, it's so vital and it's so important. Before I go on to the next one, I wanted to know if you guys had any questions about sacred ground or anything at all. I was going to show another one next, but if we have time, I'm not sure if we have time, but
I just want to jump in and say this is incredible. This is such a powerful presentation, and it's offering me ideas about things that I would love to go out and do. But just to be mindful, we do want to leave some time for Q&A, but please do go ahead and show us the next one. I can't wait to see it.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure. I wasn't sure if I was running out of time or not. So, all right. So the next one, excuse me. Again, sorry, battling a cold here. The next one that I wanted to showcase was dealing with home ownership and appraisals. And I know that we've seen the stories. I'm not sure if you guys have seen it, but many times where Black homeowners and minority homeowners have had their homes undervalued during the appraisal process. I remember hearing about this story when I was a reporter in Nashville, and I interviewed a woman who actually is the vice president of Citizens Bank. And if you all know some good Black history, Citizens Bank is probably one of the only, I don't want to say it's the only one, but it's one of the very few Black-owned banks in the country. She reached out to us because she was lowballed essentially for her home. And I was thinking to myself, you all messed with the wrong one, because this woman is not only a banker, but is a vice president of one of the top Black-owned banks in the country. So basically, she was lowballed when she was trying to appraise her home, had her white counterpart sit in, and received a higher value when her white counterpart sat in instead of her. And so I remember doing this story, and I remember another reporter did a story like this, and it was received overwhelming reviews. But for this story, I really wanted to focus on documenting what other people were experiencing and what is being done statewide as well as federally to address the issue. So I'll just play a little bit of this really here because I want to, again, open the floor up for questions, but I'll play just a little bit of it.
It's part of the American dream, purchasing property, creating generational wealth. But building that American dream hasn't been equal for everyone. Terry Horton says he experienced this firsthand in 2022.
I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Part of Horton's American dream as a landlord and owner of Horton Visionary Properties was to make affordable housing units available for people in his Cincinnati community. It's why he decided to refinance his property in order to finance his dream project. To do that, Horton had to go through an appraisal process, which allows banks to determine the value of a property.
Initially, the lender gave me an estimated value of $500,000 because at the time, the interest rates was low and it was a booming market.
But when he got his appraisal back, Horton says it was a lot less than what he expected. The value was appraised at $359,000. That $141,000 difference from the initial estimate is what's called an appraisal gap. Appraisal gaps create a few problems: buyers backing out of a home sale, or, as in Horton's case, banks being reluctant to lend more money than an asset is supposedly worth.
I discovered there were some errors in the rental payments and in the square footage. And as I started to review the appraisal, I found other errors.
He also had 2 additional appraisals done on the property. Both of them came back with values higher than $359,000. Still, Horton says the lender refused to acknowledge those new valuations. Horton began to wonder if he was lowballed because of his race.
Unfortunately, this is a problem that is truly pervasive throughout the nation.
Sharon McGowan, Horton's attorney, helped him file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. As a civil rights attorney, McGowan argues Horton's discrimination case falls within the Fair Housing Act.
We saw the appraiser ignore sales that had happened on the same block as Mr. Horton's property and go to a blacker part of town to find properties that he was going to treat as sort of the comparables. We saw him say that Mr. Horton's property was in good shape, but yet then kind of didn't really value that property and actually devalued the property in some ways. And I think what we see is all of these ways in which conscious and unconscious bias plays out in engaging in this process of deciding what is the value of a Black homeowner worth.
The lender never responded to our questions about Horton's appraisal, and the first appraiser defended his calculation, saying in a statement he used papers submitted by Horton and that comparison properties used in the later appraisals weren't equivalent. Horton and McGowan's concerns about discriminatory practices against African American homeowners is nothing new. In the 1930s, a discriminatory practice, now known as redlining, blocked access to mortgages and other loans to entire communities, primarily those of color. Federal officials created a manual for lenders that graded neighborhoods on the financial risk of a property loan in that area. Grades heavily influenced by the race and ethnicity of those living there. Areas that were considered the best investments received an A and green shading on the map. On the other end, areas in red were deemed the riskiest or least desirable. In the explanations for low grades, federal assessors often reference the presence of African Americans, immigrants, and other minority groups as threats to the stability of property values. While the federal program that produced the maps ended in the 1940s, experts say those systemic red walls still linger to this day, including in the appraisal process.
All right, so I'm going to stop it right there because I wanted to get to it, some questions. But basically for that story, we then even spoke with federal lawmakers and people who are trying to address this story head on, address this issue head on and see what they're doing. So we wanted to make sure that we were looking into the problem of appraisal bias. The whitewashing situation was done. I wanted to focus more so on how prevalent this is nationwide. And so again, we found most states are not doing much except maybe the bare minimum. When we asked states for basically what they were doing to address appraisal bias, or can you tell us how many state cases that you've had? Many of them are like, oh, well, we don't look at cases based on bias. I'm like, so you mean to tell me after all this time where people have been asked for, been talking about appraisal bias, you guys still have not changed how you categorize biases in your states? To me, I thought that was absurd. There are some states trying to do things about it, like Texas. They've collaborated with civil rights divisions, but not many states are doing things like that. And we also showcase how this issue is systemic. And you saw it in this story, you saw it even in the Sacred Ground. I like to provide context. Remember when I told you sometimes our managers may not understand what we're talking about? That's why you have to add in that context, that historical context. So for appraisal bias, it's the issue of redlining. Redlining and the language that was used to describe communities of color. That's language that's still oftentimes used today. In a later appraisal case that I found when I did an open records request, I saw somebody say in an appraisal statement, Black population in this community is above state average. What does the Black population have to do with an appraisal of a home, right? Like, so it's this innuendo that they're putting in the language of their appraisal reports that are indicating, hey, this is a Black part of town, you know, the value may drop, so they're using this kind of subjective language, which now lawmakers and policymakers are saying you cannot do that anymore. So, it's so important to make sure that you're addressing those issues and you show that historical context, because that's the kind of language that we're using in the past that some, not all appraisers, but some have used recently to determine the value of a place. And then we also spoke with the other side. I always make sure I make it a mission to make sure you're hearing that other side, because people are going to say, well, why didn't you talk to this person or that person? So one person we spoke with was with the API, American Policy Institute, because they basically try to say, oh, it's not necessarily about race. It's about the timing that you buy a home and all of that kind of stuff. And I definitely challenge him and say, well, why do you think that's the case? Historically, redlining has been an issue in the past. Why would you not think race is a factor? So we made sure that we told it from all levels and from all angles, because in a story like this, you have to, you have to provide context, you have to provide information, and you have to provide examples. So that was our appraisal bias story. So just remember, when you're investigating issues impacting communities, even consumer news, look for patterns, look for victims, look for experts, look at some loopholes that may exist in laws, state and federal policies, and expose the complexities of the injustice that's taking place. And again, that's how you dig deeper. That's how you uncover information. That's how you expose these systemic issues. And you give it that investigative angle, hook, and that lens. And of course, like I said, hold people accountable and just make sure you're following up, be persistent, do multiple stories in parts, because once again, it shows not only that your heart is in the right place of doing these stories, but the communities that you're serving will say, okay, she's serious about this. And they will respect you for it. So that's all I had. And we want to open up the floor for any questions.
I just want you to be on call, because I feel like I don't want to ask you to come to every training I ever have again. Let's jump in and get some questions going. So let's start with Brandon. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Brandon. I'm the national politics reporter at Capital B News. I'm also based in Washington, D.C. And I love this presentation. And the question I have for you is one of like process and like time management. So obviously you're working with these like really big involved stories and themes. I'm wondering, my job isn't to be an investigative reporter, but we all like to, we're a small newsroom, and so we try to think of like smaller ways that we can do these more enterprise projects. And so when you have, I'm assuming sort of you're juggling multiple balls at the same time. How do you keep everything straight? How do you make sure, one project isn't falling through while you're working on something else? But I would love to hear more about your process.
Absolutely. And by the way, I love Capital B. When I went home, I love watching it because they have a big base in Atlanta. So awesome work that you guys are doing. I just try to stay organized through and through. So in addition to doing long form investigations, I also do like consumer franchises called Watching Your Wallets. And those air weekly, right? So what I try to do is I'm like, okay, let me try to stay a month ahead on my Watching Your Wallet franchises while I'm doing the bigger work of something like Sacred Ground or Undervalued, right? So it's all about pacing yourself. So for instance, in the morning, I may wake up, spend 3 hours writing a script for my Watching Your Wallet franchise, which I know I want to stay a month ahead on. And then I may take some lunch because I need to eat. And so then I'll take a break, come back, maybe either log or listen to some interview sound for my main project. And then after that, maybe spend 2 or 3 hours on that, write my script for another project. So like you're right, you're absolutely right. I could be working on 4 or 5 projects at a time. But it's all about pacing and organizing yourself. And calendar invites, I make it a mission to make sure I have calendar invites that remind me to, okay, stop working on this, Caresse, work on something else for the meantime. Or I might have an interview coming up at, like tomorrow, I have an interview with the senator at 4:30 p.m. So before that interview, I want to make sure I knock out 2 or 3 things for one story I'm working on about lead, another story I'm working on, again, for a consumer franchise. So try to knock those things out and just pace yourself daily. Otherwise, you're going to burn yourself out. So you want to make sure you're doing great pacing. Again, Microsoft Outlook calendar invites are my best friend. Make sure that you're just pacing yourself and stacking yourself up so you're not overburdening yourself with a whole bunch of work at the same time. And always think ahead, right? If you have a deadline that's coming up, knock that out quickly if you can, while you're still working on your long form big investigations. Because trust me, I know, like it's just sometimes just me and the producer that's working on stuff. And then even my franchise is just me alone. So you just have to pace yourself and organize pretty efficiently. But it takes time, and everybody has their own way of doing things, but just find your own little flow at working it out. That's usually what I do.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Nusrat, let's go to you.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really, really informative. My name is Nusrat. I'm at the Detroit Free Press here in Michigan, and I cover economic mobility. So I cover a lot of housing issues. So to hear you talk about the appraisal bias story was really interesting, especially your process. I also have a process-related question. Yes. So I'm not an investigative reporter, but I do quite a few enterprise stories as part of my beat, and this is something I'm dealing with right now. And I don't know if I've gotten better at it throughout my time at the Free Press, but I feel like whenever I, tackle these big stories and these big projects, I can get a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of research and the reporting that I'm doing. I'm wondering if you have advice for managing just the huge amount of reporting and research that goes into these projects, especially when you get to the writing phase and especially when you get to the fact-checking stage, because I think right now I'm doing a project where I'm writing, but it's a hot mess and there are a lot of gaps and I'm trying to figure out where to go. So I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to deal with that.
Yeah, no problem. And again, another good publication. I lived in Flint and would go down to Detroit all the time. So I love the Free Press, another good one. But no, so this is what I do. Sometimes I'll create a folder. Excuse me, sorry. I'll create a folder with all of my stories that I'm working on. And then within the folder, I'll create little subfolders. And I do the same thing with my emails too, right? So if I have an email and I have different projects, I'll have subfolders so that as soon as I see an email come from one place, I throw that in the subfolder. And that's why I'm keeping track of like updates from different FOIA requests or updates from different agencies. And I'm like, I can't deal with this right now. Let me just throw this in the subfolder. And I go to my subfolder either the next day or within a couple of hours. And that's how I oftentimes keep track. Also, Microsoft Excel should also be your best friend, because that's also a way I catalog things. So I may have, like, say I'm working on a big project and I reach out to 10 states or something. I create the name, I create the name of the agency, I create another row where I'm saying, have I received a response, yes or no? Have I received a follow-up, yes or no? And then I create another tab with the latest response that they've given me. So if you need to, everybody finds their own little thing. Sometimes I even just create a little things to do list, like I have right here, right? So I have widening the pipeline on my list of things to do for the day. So it depends on however you find, like, whatever flow that you want, but it could be everything as simple as a things to do list, organizing your emails, or making an Excel spreadsheet so that you're keeping track of everything. And again, calendar reminders too. You know, if you got to call somebody back, if you got to call a source back, send a calendar invite for, I don't know, 2:30 on Thursday or something like that. That's usually how I do it. And then say I am writing a story, and this has happened to me before, and you can take it or leave it. But sometimes if it's like I'm about to go to bed and I find a nice introduction for my story, I'll just run to my computer, or I'll get a notepad and just write it down, so that if it's in my head at the moment, but I can't get to it, I just write it down really quickly. And I'm like, I'm going to get back to that. So find little ways of that'll help you easier. Again, it's about pacing yourself, right? Because I know it can be overwhelming. When even as a general assignment reporter, before I even got into investigations, it was a lot to deal with. But if you just find ways of, like, giving yourself organized blotches so that you're not overburdening yourself, I think that will be helpful. So try with the Excel spreadsheet, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It could just be, the name of a place, the organization, if you've heard back, what you're waiting on, and that way and just check in daily and keep it up. It may take a minute for you to get in the flow of it, but you're going to create your own little flow in terms of how you're organizing your information. So I hope that makes sense.
Let's go to Keisha.
Hey, I'm Keisha. I'm a producer at PBS NewsHour. My question is, you mentioned that for the Sacred Ground series, that came from a tip, but I'm curious what other ways you curate investigative pitches when it doesn't come from a tip.
Yeah, sometimes it can happen. Again, great question. Sometimes it can happen after you file an open records request or a FOIA. When I was working in Nashville, Tennessee, there were times where I wanted to say there was a shady builder. I heard that a contractor was doing shady stuff. I'd file an open records request with the state and say, hey, do you have any complaints against this person? And he would be like, yeah, actually, we have about 10 complaints. And I'll say, oh, great. Can I file another open records request to get access to those complaints? And once I get access to those complaints, I know the name, I know the email of the people that asked for it. And then I can contact them. And then that's where, of course, then you have to do kind of some schmoozing to get them to open up and talk to you. But there you go, you have access to that. So oftentimes when people have complaints or they file complaints, that's open record, especially if it's with the state or with the federal government. Now, sometimes the federal government may redact the information, but most of the time you can actually see that. I do that all the time too with my consumer franchises with the Better Business Bureau. The Better Business Bureau actually has a tab where people can actually say if they want to talk to the media or not. And so that oftentimes helps me to find victims or people who have had a hard time. So that's another way to go about it. If you know there's an issue, try filing with agencies to see if complaints have been filed. And people oftentimes will have that information, and that's readily available for you because it's public knowledge. You just have to ask for the public records request. So that would be sometimes the back way of doing that. And then also, like I said, I didn't even know the guy, Robert Stubblefield, that ended up going to the Supreme Court. I just typed in Black cemetery desecration, and that came up. The Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition instantly came up. And then I did some more digging and found the community that it happened to in Virginia. And then I just reached out to them. I found an email address for them, and that's how I was able to get them to talk to me. And the one actually I was the most difficult to talk to, the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, after doing some, networking and not networking, I'm sorry, after doing some background calls, they open up to me in tremendous ways. So sometimes it's just going to take doing some research, doing some digging, seeing what communities are being impacted by something, and then reaching out to them directly. So try open records request, and then finding emails and contacts. Sometimes even going on Facebook or LinkedIn, like Rachel said. When I was trying to find the other side to the appraisal bias case, people who may be from conservative think tanks, I went on LinkedIn and just typed in appraisal bias, click. And I saw a group of people that were like, it's not about race, it's this and that. And I was like, all right, good. And that's how I found the people who were like on the other side. And it worked because I did get some criticism from some people who were like, oh, before they even watched the story, right? They just watched the promo for it. And they were saying, oh, I bet she didn't even talk to somebody on the other side. And I'm like, actually, I did. So, so that's doing it.
Before we go to Julian, can you tell us exactly the details of how much she was undervalued, the woman who was the vice president of the bank?
Yeah. She, I think, and I'm trying to quote because it's been a couple of years since I did the story, but I think her home came in at about 800 or 900,000 or something like that. And then when she got the other valuation, it came in over $1 million. So she, yeah.
So
this
she
was
like having it staged and everything with white people, so that it was owned by white people.
They're a Black couple, and they had their white friends come in and sit in, and pretty much took off any type of indication that Black people were part of the home. And it came back with,
oh no.
But she knew all the right things to do. But sadly, many people don't know what to do in those situations, which is why these stories are so important to tell.
We can take at least one more question. Julian, jump in.
Yeah. Hey, Caresse. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Julian. I'm a fellow at the Boston Globe. I'm wondering about like doing multi-part series, right? Like the Sacred Ground series. Do you kind of structure the release of that? Is it based off of when you get the info? You know, was that something y'all planned from the jump for it to be multi-parts? And also last, like, when do you know when to begin one part and end another part?
Right. No, good question, Julian. So after the very first one, my producer and I were like, when we started collecting the information and hearing from more and more people, we said, this cannot just be a one part story. It cannot be. So we focused it, we laid it out. So basically the first part will kind of be the introduction into what do we mean when we say sacred ground, right? What do we mean when we say this is happening to certain people? So we wanted the first part to be like the introduction for people who may not know that this thing is happening. And then the second part was going to be kind of specifically talking about other cases. Like, this is not the only one. This is happening here. This is happening there. And then the third part will be what action is being conducted, what action is being done to address this issue. So that's kind of how we were able to break it up into different parts. But no, we knew that we wanted it to be multiple parts from the beginning. And then there was a matter of organizing how we wanted to establish those parts. And then sometimes, like the lawmakers never even responded to us in the first when part one was being made. But finally, when part one and part two went out, we said, okay, we have enough to talk about action. And we wanted to follow through with the Supreme Court hearing. And so we went back to lawmakers and we're like, hey, we asked you all to speak. Part one and part two aired. Here's the link. Would you all mind talking about this? I know you guys have been pushing for funding for this issue. And I was actually shocked that they said, yeah, let's do an interview. So sometimes it just takes persistence and following up. We knew that it was going to be more than one part. We didn't expect the lawmakers to actually like respond to us so quickly after part one and part two. So I would say have an idea of what you want. And sometimes things may not make it, in my case, because I'm in broadcast, you may not make it in the broadcast. Use that as an extra, use that as a way to like do a good visualization. At NICAR, I just saw a beautiful presentation that CNN did, and they were doing something on maternal health and postpartum depression. And because so many women don't want to talk about it, what they did was they used the audio recordings as a visual medium on their website. And so you can hear the women talking about what they experienced. So sometimes if it can't make it in your story, use it as a good visualization in your web copy. So you're just all about like saying, okay, what do I have? What's the number one priority? What could come second? What can come third? And what could be web extras, right? So that's usually how I kind of organize it. Because it can be overwhelming when you have everything in front of you. But it's just about making sure you prioritize what's 1, 2, 3.
Caresse, we are near the end of our hour, but I wanted to jump in with one more question, and that is, we've reached this point in our nation's history where in many ways we have so much opportunity to address and confront equity issues, our racial demons and things that have transpired. And yet we're also dealing with so much resistance and pushback, and so much people saying, let's let it go. It was in the past. So can you share with us how you push through when those things happen? When you hear those comments, when people are sort of saying, why are we still talking about this stuff? What kind of coping mechanisms do you have? What advice would you give?
Well, after not being frustrated by hearing that over and over again, I usually basically say, but the remnants of what happened in the past still happen to this day. It was not that long ago, is what I tell them. And so I often say, that's why I always say the context, adding that context in your story matters. Peeling the layer back and showing people, whether it's through broadcast, radio, or print, that there's a reason why we are where we are today, is what I oftentimes tell people. Because I do hear that a lot too. Like, well, it's in the past, it has nothing to do with me. Well, it has everything to do with you. It has everything to do with what we're experiencing today. So, which is why I always tell people, make sure when you're pitching these stories, you give people the magnitude of why it's important. I remember one time I was doing a story in New Orleans, and it was about the New Orleans East community, which was at the highlight of its time at one point before the 90s. Then it started to kind of wither away. And then Katrina happened, and it just never recovered. And so you saw a rise in crime, you saw a rise in all sorts of other things. And I remember I wanted to do a deep dive into the New Orleans East community that is not just why are these shootings happening? I wanted to really peel a layer back. And my boss said to me, well, why do you think other people will care? And I said, you know what, let me tell you something. I said, when you're driving in from Atlanta, where I grew up, to New Orleans, the first place you see is New Orleans East. And if the first thing you see are eyesores and lights not working, what is that going to say when you finally make it to the city, like make it to the French Quarter? People are going to be like, oh God, this place is, it's not right. So I had to like literally quickly put it into perspective for them. Like, not only is it an issue with the people in the community, it affects everybody. It affects everybody around the area. So finally, after that, I got the green light on that story, right? I made it about green. It's about the economy. It's about people. It's about us overall as people and as a city. And it stuck with them. So when people are trying to tell you that, let it hit home for them why this resonates, why it matters to them, and giving that broader appeal. Because if it's affecting one community, it's affecting all communities. So that's what I usually have to say. After I have to tone down my annoyance, after they ask me that question over and over again.
Caresse Jackman, I want to be you when I grow up, and I'm 30 years older than you. That's how incredible this conversation has been. Your dedication and your expertise are absolutely invaluable, and I want you to know that you are now a member of the Widening the Pipeline family. So thank you so much. And please, let's show some Zoom hands to show her our appreciation for joining us today. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. And thank you to all of you. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to speak with you. And please, if you all have any questions, let me know. I'm more than happy to answer and help you all along the way, okay?
All right, great. We'll be in touch. I'll definitely be in touch. Thank you so much, Caresse.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.